ncIMPACT is made possible by funding from Civic Federal Credit Union and is a public media North Carolina production in association with the University of North Carolina School of Government.
We didn't have a chance to get to all of the questions that came in for the Facebook Live, but our guests have agreed to stick around and try to answer as many as possible. So here goes. We'll start with you, Bruce. Once broadband infrastructure is in place, how can we make sure it's affordable to all households?
I think the most critical way is law that supports whether we think about it as a utility in our state and how we can regulate to ensure that it's affordable. Short of that is ensuring that there's a great deal of competition. Competition usually breeds favorable pricing for the consumer. So, there are people who are more versed in how that actually works who can suggest the details, but those are the two pathways I see to ensuring that it becomes affordable.
Next question is from Ken. He wants to know, is there any way to motivate the internet providers to go the last mile? I'm going to toss that to you, Patrick.
Oh, you better believe it. And we've actually seen that motivation really working in a big way. At the Rural Center, we have a large conference center, and so we hosted in the fall of 2019, USDA Rural Development with their Reconnect program did an outreach session on their grants program with providers. It was packed. The grade office came in, or the state broadband office came in 1 month later, did the same thing, again with providers. The place was packed. We see incredible amount of enthusiasm among broadband provider companies, and it's a mix of companies. They tend to be small companies. They tend to be also our legacy telephone membership cooperatives that originally brought telephone service to many of the rural parts of our state are very much a major player in the mix. Because of some legislation that passed in the last session of General Assembly, our rural electric cooperatives are now getting very aggressive in this space. They won't be providing internet service to their members, but they will be partnering with companies who will provide internet service to their members. And I see more energy in this space of company interest than I've ever seen before. And as I mentioned, the one thing you have to understand about rural is just like electricity, just like telephone, we had to subsidize those services in order to get them started and in order to make them widely available. That is still the model that will work for broadband and is working for broadband. As I mentioned, because of we have funded a state-based program because there is federal funding in place and that we've seen some improvement in federal programs. There is more construction actually going on across rural parts of our state and in more places than ever before. And we've learned, particularly with the state program, with precision, it really can address and does address those unserved and underserved communities because we've designed a program that allows us to do that.
So this is almost a follow-up question, Patrick, so I'm going to stick with you for a second. This is coming from Lauren. Do you see a Rural Electrification Act of 1936 for broadband in the near future?
I don't necessarily see that specific act, though I do think, as I mentioned, the bipartisan nature of support, particularly in the General Assembly around broadband issues, led to the establishment of a state-based grants program. And I think it's proven that it can work. They will soon be announcing their second round of grants. What's missing is the order of magnitude, funding it at a level that will get the job done. And that's the next step in terms of really the construction of the infrastructure, I believe. And I do think you often hear legislators refer to how rural communities got electricity, how they got telephone. And that is also how they're going to get broadband.
Thank you. Sonia, this question is for you. How does the lack of access impact other vital parts of education delivery outside of academic instruction, like providing social services for students?
Great question. And I think I heard the end, you said student support services, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So our counselors are essentially now, as we know, key part of education for a number of students. And also, when you ask that question, I think of our exceptional children's students and the importance that they receive those service hours. I mean, that is a requirement. And so computers are actually the way they are staying connected. But we also have teachers who are needing to report to counselors, students who might need a little extra support at this time. So it is making it more challenging. But those services are still being offered. And just this week, there's actually a team that's kind of hitting the streets to check in on students that they haven't been logging on, they haven't been hearing from them, and they just want to do a well check to make sure that things are going okay. So those services are still being delivered, but it is a little more challenging when everyone is outside the school building.
Very good. I'm going to stick with you, Sonia, for this next question, which comes from Deidre, who must be a mom. The question is, how can we be sure not only that students have access, but that it's safe access?
Great question. So oftentimes people have asked about donating laptops during this time. I do appreciate the generosity that's been extended to students. And I often have to share that we're so glad to have a nonprofit like E2D where laptops can be kind of re-envisioned, reused. But CMS sticks with one type of device because it does need to make sure that the proper filters are put on it. And so when devices come into the school district, they don't just go back out. Filters are put on them. And because we already have that filter on there, then the hotspot was not as much a concern because you're just trying to then get them on to the internet because the device is already filtered. But you do there are a number of organizations that wanted to support some type of virtual tutoring. And the school district had to make the decision that because it would be very difficult to monitor that student's interaction with that adult, which is easily done in a school building, right? Because especially if you're working with a student in the media center where people can see what's happening and monitor it, those types of supports did have to be shut down right now until we can figure out a way that someone is able to actually monitor an adult external to the district then working with the student.
Well, I have to say that all gives the mom in me some comfort. Thank you. Patrick, back to you. How can communities work to minimize monopolies, broadband, internet service providers as monopolies in rural communities and homes?
Well, I think the best thing they can do is really be advocates for broadband, for competition to their elected officials at the local level and at the state level and at the federal level. All three play important roles in making your voice heard, making your concerns heard. We've heard throughout the course of this show lots of personal examples of people that really are telling their unique stories. And that is incredibly important. And I want to encourage your listeners to really do a lot more of that and to really become advocates around this rural broadband with your county commissioners, with your town council members, with your state legislators, with your members of Congress. Become vocal. Write a letter to the editor about the struggle you're having, to your local newspaper, but make your voice heard.
Bruce, this one is specifically for you. How are internet providers involved in the alliance? What motivates them to provide affordable services given that they're competing for dollars and profit?
So really early on in the alliance, we made a decision that we would have a member-based structure to give some confidence to everyone why we were there and what we were doing. And as part of that, we chose to not allow internet service providers to become members of the Charlotte Digital Inclusion Alliance. And so they are, however, allowed to participate in our meetings. We do have an open meeting invitation so they can come and share their work. We often invite them in when there's new programs AT&T Access, when they rolled out, they came in and gave us a presentation and provided us materials. And Spectrum Internet Assist, the same thing. We're working a lot with them as well. So there's definitely a spirit of collaboration, but in terms of the actual decision-making structure of the CDIA, we left it to the community-based organizations who are on the ground doing the work. And you know, the second part of that question, how do we incentivize them to make prices affordable? This is where I go back to, I think we've said it again and again, is advocating to our elected officials, and then perhaps considering long-term, what does it look like we've done with our utilities, with water, electric. Is broadband become the next utility? I think we might see that more in the future. I don't know, but maybe taking us all the way back to the beginning, if I had a crystal ball, that may be one way to help ensure that cost remains affordable for everyone. And it's different for so many people. For some communities, cost affordability is $5 a month or $10 a month. For others, that's as much as 30 and 40. So I don't know if there's a single solution necessarily, but being mindful of what that means, what affordability means to everyone.
Well, apparently you do have a crystal ball, because the next question, which comes from Leah, is whether there are any examples of communities where the government is treating broadband like a utility.
And there are. We've had several communities that have done that in this state. We haven't seen any of that recently because there's now a prohibition against local governments becoming ISPs and providing that service directly. We do have some communities that are grandfathered in. City of Wilson is probably the best known example from a rural standpoint. Greenlight was started by the City of Wilson, has been extremely successful. By the same token, there was another effort in the city of Salisbury that started that wasn't as successful, and they have been trying to sell that service to a private provider. So this is space where there is a lot of there is quite a bit of division around this issue and whether or not local government should become ISPs. We have found at the Rural Center that is not a part of the fight that is particularly productive or worth having at this point in time, particularly given the makeup of the General Assembly and the way that leadership really feels about that issue. And we've accepted that. We also at the Rural Center have done a lot of work with local governments around operating water and sewer infrastructure, and we know that some of the most challenged towns in our state from an economic standpoint are those that are really struggling with how do they maintain this water and sewer system that they have. It's a huge sustainability question. So we're reluctant for an open up all-in approach to every local government becoming an ISP. We're not necessarily thinking that's the right answer either, but it's a complicated territory. It could be done profitably by some. Again, the more dense, the greater economies of scale that you have because of the number of users, the more likelihood it is to be viable. But I don't think this is a viable path forward that's going to do much in the foreseeable future.
Sonia, Bruce, Patrick, thank you again. Thank you for sticking around and answering all these great questions from our viewers. And of course, to all the folks watching on Facebook Live, can't thank you enough for your participation. That's it. This is ncIMPACT.